We are recording.
Thank
Fantastic.
you. Welcome to the
Great.
Funding Impact Measurement Working Group for February 26th. We are under the CHAOSS Code of Conduct, so please be kind to each other. I think I'll turn it over to Paul, who I think was going to facilitate, maybe.
Yep. Happily welcome everyone from my side. It's great to see so many keen and eager faces. Perhaps just a bit of context for those that weren't here last week. So we discussed the kind of objectives and the goals of this impact measurement working group. I hope everyone's checked out the repo. But for those that weren't here last time and just want to sort of double check on what this is all about, we're basically aiming to develop frameworks, metrics, and methodologies for measuring and understanding the impact of funding on open source software development. And it's quite a range of people and perspectives in this group. Yeah, I think, Sean, it's best if you continue as is. That's fine, thank you. We talked also about a number of sort of different ideas of how we can structure this group and how we can kind of come up with some outputs. I'll jump straight into the agenda unless anyone has any questions or wants anything clarified. Or Dawn and Glenn, you have any comments? Otherwise, happy to hand it over to Glenn, who's going to talk about the slide series, which we discussed last time.
Yeah, so I was just going to say maybe regarding the agenda, the slide series is kind of part of the knowledge base, which is the third agenda item. So I was wondering if we could merge those two before getting into Sarkan's, yeah, great suggestion
Yeah,
of discussing the Eurostack.
move it up.
So yeah, it's great to see many familiar faces here and some new faces. My name's Kaylin Osborne, for those that don't know me yet. And so the idea between the slide series, which I proposed at the last meeting and kicked off, is that since we're trying to build up a knowledge base of, you know, various things, including studies on funding and funding impacts, it'd be great to just to synthesize key learnings from these prior studies and put them in a bite-sized format. So I've created this slide series template, which basically should have only 4 slides, but please forgive me, I went a bit over because it was hard to synthesize it. So maybe we can adapt the template as we move forward. In any case, to kick us off, yeah, if you go down 2 slides, synthesize the toolkit that I wrote with Dawn, Paul, and Mirko. Many of you have heard this speech, this talk a few times, so I beg you for your patience as we go through this. But hopefully this is useful and interesting to others. And yeah, before I get into it, I just want to say it would be great if at the end of this meeting someone could volunteer for next week's the next meeting, which is in 2 weeks' time, and to synthesize a paper maybe they have written. For example, I see many people here that have done relevant research. I'm looking amongst others at Johan.
So I
Done
was looking at
lots.
Johan too.
So if you want to volunteer, be our guest, but you don't have to. It'd be great. But yeah, it'd be really great if at the end of this call we can, if someone can volunteer to do the next slides and present them in the next meeting. So just to go over these slides that I prepared, starting with a problem. So these are myself and my co-authors of this, Don and Paul are here. We're working on this question of what are the impacts of public funding, public investments in open source. I myself, being at the Linux Foundation, I'm involved in the NGI Commons Consortium, which is a consortium funded by the European Commission. And amongst other things, what we're trying to do is measure the impacts of around 200 million euros that since 2019 have gone into open source software development. And Paul here is from the Sovereign Tech Fund, which since 2022 has been has invested quite a lot of money. Paul, you'd have to jump in here with his precise numbers, but into the security and maintenance of critical open source software infrastructure. So we were, grappling with these questions and trying to figure out a really, a meaningful way to do these measurements, because we're talking about taxpayers' money here, and we are kind of, what we want to do is produce sort of meaningful, thorough research that produces meaningful findings that can hopefully inform future funding programs. And we're also guided by a bunch of relevant research, including Johan's, which tells us a bunch of things, which is, includes, funding supports maintenance. It's really, really valuable, but it doesn't solve all the problems. Other finding from prior research is that money is the least important motivator for contributors, and it changes the social dynamics in projects, especially amongst volunteers. There are a variety of ways of kind of trying to quantify value from open source, guided by the question of, what type of value for whom. I really encourage you to go watch Sophia Vargas's talk at FOSSI, where she brilliantly kind of gives an overview of various approaches. And finally, we're informed by various research papers which look at social model, the social world around open source software projects, as well as all contributor models, which look at various technical and non-technical contributors in open source projects. So to summarize this slide, we're trying to figure out how to measure the impacts of public funding in a meaningful way. And we know that funding is important, but doesn't solve all the problems. And there are so many different ways we can go. So we need to figure out which way to go and how to do it. Yeah, the QR code goes to Sophia's presentation. So then solution, well, since this isn't a funding program that we studied, it's a toolkit. For this section of the slides, I just put in the kind of key messages from our toolkit. First one is just major challenges that we face. And there's no one size fits all approach to funding impact measurement. And reasons for that include the heterogeneity of projects and ecosystems, funding objectives and approaches, data availability, non-randomness of funding, and so on. Just to kind of elaborate on these, data availability is actually a major issue that we're facing with NGI Commons. So the NGI has funded over 1,200 projects, and there's a database on the NGI website with over 1,200 projects, but it lacks key information that would make kind of programmatic collection of data very, very, it makes it very difficult. So for example, it doesn't include repos, doesn't include information like, when the project's got funding and how much. And so we've been grappling with, okay, given this great, vast number of projects that have received funding, what is the best way to collect this information without creating too many burdens for the developers that have received this funding? I think, Paul, in your case, it's not exactly the same, right? Because you've funded fewer projects, and I believe you have documentation on exactly how much money projects got and for what purposes. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the lucky position that we have both pretty clear information about, or data as to exactly what was paid, when, and how. And also on that point of, kind of starting with the why, that's been the really kind of crucial question for us, or one of the major sort of methodological difficulties, is that we don't have, per se, like a kind of universal STA effect, because we're inevitably funding different types of work, and as a consequence, the measures for the outcomes of that work are going to be entirely different. So you can't, per se, kind of compare them. In some instances, or for some projects, we fund documentation work, or we fund kind of community work, or in others, it's more kind of clearly sort of software development work or infrastructure work. And so for the sake of, just as a bit of background and exegesis on this, like, we can't say to policy stakeholders, this is the sort of the direct impact of what we're doing as, a whole. It has to be sort of looking at the isolated cases to some degree, maybe having some kind of categories of different types of work that's funded, but by and large, looking really at use cases. And we've got 60 funded projects at the moment, and I think the total amount is about 23 million that we've given out so far. And so there's really a kind of huge diversity in sort of possible impacts in that sense. Yeah.
Great. And just moving on with the other kind of fundamentals, as Paul mentioned, starting with why is really, we argue, is an important, first step. Trying to contextualize the funding within the agreed objectives. But it's not just about looking at whether a task was completed, but we're also trying to think about, okay, what is the multiplier effect of this funding, and what are the knock-on effects for society? And actually, on this point, I want to share with you a problem or question that I'm grappling with. So one of the projects that has been funded by the NGI is Mastodon, right? And Mastodon's actually received 2 grants. One is kind of a general support grant for the nonprofit, and the other I'll share actually in the chat, is for quoting, it's for the, it's to design and develop and implement activity pub implementation of quote posts, so that users of Mastodon and various Mastodon servers can, quote previous posts like you can on Twitter and so on. And so we're asking ourselves, okay, beyond the fact, so this grant started last year February, but beyond the fact that this implementation was successfully completed, what is the societal value of being able to quote posts on Mastodon? So I'd love to just put this over to the group. Does anyone have any ideas or thoughts on what the societal value is of being able to quote posts on Mastodon?
I don't see the way to raise my hand while I'm screen sharing, or maybe Zoom changed its software again. But I mean, as a person who participates in a lot of social media from time to time, the ability to quote posts is kind of important. I don't go scour the internet for interesting things. I usually reshare things from people I follow and add my own 2 cents to whatever they said. So in terms of maintaining engagement, which I think is part of the purpose of social media, I think quoting posts is pretty important.
And there were some legitimate reasons, I think, when they decided not to allow quote posts, which I am forgetting now, but maybe somebody else remembers. Because they didn't not do it because they didn't know about it. They didn't do it for very deliberate reasons.
Yeah.
I think that's actually probably the most important part of this, because it's impossible to define like what the value is of allowing these quote posts without understanding the context of what it was before. Not having a starting point in order to determine, what the actionable change was, it doesn't give you the picture, right? And I think that's like the whole point of the insights. It's like, okay, before there was funding, what was the state of play? After funding, how did that change? Right? Maybe Mastodon got more money and they were tasked with a certain thing, and so they decided to do this. But it's only because something wasn't working and they weren't implementing it before. So yeah, I think that story, Don, is probably the most important part here.
I would just pick up on that and say, I entirely agree with you, Zachary, that the context, or the historical context rather, is a kind of key measure, or it's key to understanding the change that was brought about. I think also one thing that occurs to me, and this is kind of more broader and a bit normative, and the background for this is that like 2 weeks ago I was at a workshop on kind of reimagining digital public spaces. And this label of digital public spaces had been kind of applied retroactively to digital platforms, right? Which are, predominantly kind of closed spaces. And the discussion was about, okay, how do we kind of, think about, sort of quasi socio-technical fixes like interoperability to redesign these spaces. And I think quite quickly, you run up against kind of questions of, if we're talking about measurements, like how do you measure kind of broader normative policy goals or kind of like subjective values, right? Like how do you measure digital sovereignty in a sense? Like what indicators do you use for that? And I think like part of the interest around ActivityPub is that it does, it enables certainly policymakers to find leverage to get towards some of these more broadly conceived kind of policy goals, I think. I would be really fascinated to see if like someone has kind of sort of ideas about, beyond say, kind of obvious sort of economic indicators, how you measure stuff like digital sovereignty or digital public engagement and that kind of thing. Getting a bit too kind of conceptual, I think, and slightly straying from your original question, Clean, but like it's a fun one to think about.
No,
Can I add
sorry.
something else?
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
please, Serkan, go ahead.
I mean, I want, this is a good question, let's say, that how would we measure the specific features value? But I also want to point out that how difficult it is to maybe ask for an external party for your features, let's say, that from the Mastodon's perspective, imagine that you are going to ask a permission, a grant for every feature that you are going to implement, which would make it incredibly difficult for them to, let's say, build a proper product. Let's also focus on that difficulty, let's say. Related to Mastodon, for instance, we are also having very active conversations under NGI Commons metrics channel, by the way. And someone posted that Mastodon moved its ownership to a non-profit organization, which is like something that we should celebrate. I can understand that, let's say, view. But meanwhile, I was looking at what is the adoption of Blue Sky, which is rather 1 year old, and Mastodon is apparently 10 years old. Mastodon has, I think, 1 million active users, while Blue Sky is already 30 million users. So we can also ask, what are we trying to achieve, let's say? The Blue Sky apparently secured $15 million from a VC. So now they can hire the best talents, best product owners, etc., and probably the UX designers, etc., etc. So they can build their features with the resources they have from a single point. And then we are trying to build alternatives for these solutions. But then for every feature, that should we fund them? Should we not fund them? Let's also focus maybe on that part. Let's say we should not make it super bureaucratic for these initiatives, and then ask for justification for these grants. I mean, let's also focus on the other side, I would say.
I think that's a really interesting nuance. Do you want to come back in on that, Clea?
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that point. I think that's definitely something we should be thinking about. I'm just conscious of time, so perhaps we should get back to the presentation, and then.
Yeah, do you want to time box it and just, let's say, take maybe another 2 or 3 minutes? Is that?
Yeah. And then I want to get over to Serkan's point about the Eurostack. So yeah, just to go over the remaining fundamentals. So what we made the case for is, accounting for project life stage and social structures, accounting for cost factors. For example, the nonprofit of Mastodon is based in Germany. So we'd be considering, okay, how much they were receiving and, contextualize for, salary structures there. Next slide, please. We also kind of map out all the various different types of impacts, what, when, how, and where. As you'll see later on the next slide, we consider social, economic, and technological impacts, which can be direct or indirect, as well as internal, as in taking place within a project itself, or external amongst its ecosystem of users and dependents. I won't read out all of these points here, but as you can see, here are the various kind of direct and indirect, internal and external impacts that we were thinking about as we were writing this paper. If you can go up just one more time, one of the things that we are thinking about very much, at least on the NGI Commons side, is multiplier effect estimation and kind of adapting existing methodologies for multiplier effect estimations in fixed and controlled environments, R&D environments, to the open source software context. And I'm not sure if my colleague Adrian has been able to join. Adrian, are you here?
Yep.
Oh yeah, I see you.
I'm here.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So Adrian and I are working on this, and that's our kind of big headache at the moment, but positive headache because it's actually quite a fascinating question. And the last thing I'll say here is methodological considerations. So often it's the case that policymakers need quantitative evidence of multiplier effects or return on investments. It's understandable why they want numbers to kind of back up policy decisions or programs. But what we've learned is that it's very, very hard to do this work in just a quantitative way. And we advocate for a mixed methods approach with a strong emphasis on interviews with developers as well as users of funded open source projects. On that note, we'll just go to the last slide, which is key learnings, slide 12. So already covered most of these things. But one thing you should take away from this is there's no one size fits all approach to measuring impacts of open source funding, and we're really looking forward to figuring out different ways of doing this in a proper, thorough, and meaningful way with all of you. So thanks for being here. And since this is a toolkit rather than a study, we don't have any information in the next slide on sustainability outcomes. So yeah, that's the end. So I guess before we move on to Serkan, it would be great if someone here can volunteer to add some slides on a study that they have written or they think is informative about impacts of funding and their measurements. Any volunteers?
Yeah.
Is the idea that we'd use this template or just add slides to this same presentation?
The idea is that we'd use a template like this, yeah. And I think for the sake of, the slides being easily digestible as well, feel free to be a little shorter and sharper in the kind of framing of it. This problem, solution, kind of structure, I think works nicely. Yeah, if Sean, you want to give it a crack for next time, that would be fantastic.
Sure. If no one else wants to, I can share some things.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
I didn't get your question, Osborne. You said if someone can volunteer to do what?
Yeah, someone, by all means, Daniel, if you'd like to volunteer to do it as well. I don't think we want necessarily to, kind of highlight each one as we go through the sessions. It's about building up a kind of sort of almost like a library of these different approaches and slides highlighting different ways of addressing impact.
Daniel, do you want to go next time in 2 weeks, or do you want to go next time in 4 weeks?
Okay, I can go next time in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you, Jen.
Next
Perfect.
time. Yeah.
Great. I mean, that leads us neatly onto a point that we had on the agenda next, which is a kind of knowledge base and recommended reading. We talked about this last time, and I think we had a bit of a back and forth about what to label it really. But I recall that we sort of landed on the idea of just having a space perhaps on the repo where we can share recommended articles and different approaches. I mean, I saw that Zachary was asking in the chat earlier about if we have something like that already. And however we want to label it, and knowledge-based recommended reading, this might be something that we could address there. And I think if people even want to add links in the chat, or we, as in Clean and Dawn and myself, can start creating a space for that, and people can feel free to add links if they'd like. That might be a good way to go. Happy to give that a crack and report back to the group next time around. Cool.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Unless there are any other comments on this kind of knowledge-based recommended reading thing, I think it's fairly straightforward. I'd be happy to hand over to Serkan to kick us off with a bit of a discussion about Eurostack.
Sure. Right after our last meeting, Francesca Bria posted on LinkedIn that they published this Eurostack report. Since last year, there were some meetings around this idea, Eurostack idea, I think mostly led by Cristina Cafara, again, together with Francesca Bria. I remember in one of the meetings, there was the founder of Signal, Adriana Groh from Sovereign Tech Agency. And basically, the main concern is that in Europe, we have heavy reliance on big tech solutions from US and also from, together with lately and maybe last decade, we have heavy reliance on cloud providers. And now together with AI, these concerns are at a very high level, let's say. So there were a lot of meetings around this topic. And the main issue or main concern is that if Trump will be elected, he might use this against sort of Europe, these high dependencies. So we should start thinking about alternative solutions. That was, I think, main theme. And so Francesca Bria, together with some other authors, they put this report and published it last, I think, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago. I had a chance to read it. It's very extensive. It touches 7 different tech layers, let's say, literally starting from rare earth minerals, and then network layers, cables, 5G networks, etc., and then builds up to IoT, software, AI, data, etc. And looks at all the layers. What are the Europe's dependencies? And for us, the interesting bit is, of course, that software is one of the critical layers. And they in the report they mentioned open source software can become an alternative solution for us to reduce these reliances, let's say. And there's a direct reference to Sovereign Tech Agency. And let's say one of the, I think we can take it as a good point, is that in the report, it mentions that 11.1 million budget is allocated to STA, and which they say it like that's a very modest one. In general, the general proposal is to build a EU-level sovereign tech agency, sovereign tech fund, with a 300 billion euros for the next decade, let's say. That's a very ambitious, of course, figure, and it's just a proposal, but time-wise, it's very interesting because EU budget conversations are about to happen in European Parliament. So that's why they are going to push for this agenda. And as afraid Trump is actually really sort of using its power against EU, etc. So I hear a lot of people are saying that, okay, Cristina Cafara or these conversations were right. So there might be a good momentum that Eurostack can be taken seriously, let's say. Which then, of course, I think for us, it can be very interesting how this EU-level fund, the software layer funding can be allocated to maybe open source ecosystem to build alternatives for big tech, etc. So from that perspective, I wanted to share it in this group. If there are others with an opinion, we can talk about it. One, let's say, these are the good bits, but when we look at the policy recommendations, unfortunately, it doesn't mention direct funding to open source ecosystem. That option is not there. There are 3 recommendations. First one is adopt open source solutions in the procurement processes. That's good. And then there's 2 others. I can look into it. But it doesn't specifically say that, okay, open source software requires direct funding like STA is doing it. that I don't see that recommendation anywhere. And I also had a small remark about that part, let's say, on LinkedIn. And again, if there are others with an opinion on the report, feel free to share it, or well, we can discuss. Or if you have any questions, feel free. Again, I had a chance to read it.
Thank you for the overview, Serkan. Maybe just a couple of comments to sort of get more into the discussion, I guess, and just sort of proffering these there as, sort of basis for discussion, maybe. One of the interesting sort of criticisms I heard of this report was that it's very much a kind of EU policy approach, right? That it doesn't necessarily take into account the realities of how software is developed, even though the goal of it is to address these various stacks. And I think it's a good instance again of this kind of sort of the multiple sort of lenses that people are applying to look at and understand open source. Because it talks about digital infrastructure, it talks about digital sovereignty. All of these things, and using open source as a kind of linchpin to achieve these policy goals, which may not even necessarily be something that's desirable, I guess, depending on your perspective. The report also mentions quite a bit about maintenance and innovation, right? Which is maybe a kind of tension, and there's a sort of two goals that are sort of measured, I think, in different ways, trying to tie it more specifically to the sort of substance or focus of this group. And yeah, I wondered what people were thinking about, how we could think about, at least when it comes to the software, the open source software stack within this, what sort of questions of measurement arise from that, as it were. Anyone has any thoughts?
I see Johan's hand is up.
Sorry, Johan, I didn't see. Sorry.
But we can't hear you.
Yeah, Johan, your mic may not be working.
Sorry, my mic was not on. I was thinking, or in a lot of these cases, there's discussions or rabble about European open source software. But I mean, looking at it, taking a step back, and a lot of these reports, like the Eurostack, it's about digital sovereignty, promoting European competitiveness. That's the main drivers of the EU in these contexts. For as I think, as Paul was talking about previously, like how can we talk about, or how can we measure digital sovereignty? I mean, or sovereignty in my mind is control or influence. And can we measure influence or control impact of open source? Then maybe we can see, okay, Europe has this and that much influence on these critical parts of the infrastructure, which are key for the European digital public infrastructure. Then we maybe don't need to talk about a Eurostack with, I haven't read this report, but then maybe we don't need to talk about European open source, but rather as open source as the digital public good cross-border international thing it is, and rather talk about, just as companies do, how much influence do we have, how much influence do we need. I mean, that's a rationale for how companies design their community engagement, how much they contribute if they hire onboard an external existing contributor, or if they take the long term and onboard an internal developer. A similar rationale in some ways could be brought over to like the public policy perspective. So I think maybe this leads me to a question I had before, like how, when we talk about measuring the impact of funding, what perspective are we talking about? Are we talking about from the policy perspective, what's the end goals that we want to measure? Or, I mean, started with the goal and then the question and then the metric, rather than this feature. Yeah.
Thanks, Johan. I think it's a really good way of characterizing it, thinking about the goal and then sort of applying the metric retrospectively. One of the things that we talk a little bit about in the paper, and Clean, if you want to jump in, feel free, is, the kind of economic indicators that are important for justifying funding or investments, rather, another way of putting it, in open source, right? And I would have thought, given the kind of the agenda that the Eurostack is sort of advancing and trying to promote, one way you can try and think about, although I don't think I think it's restrictive, and I think obviously it's problematic in some ways. One way you can try and think about digital sovereignty as this thing to be pursued is, sort of adoption, usage of open source, kind of other economic indicators of innovation and so on. It's interesting to me as well, coming from the Sovereign Tech Agency, again, is this tension between sort of, as it were, innovation and feature development and building new things, whilst at the same time recognizing the existing problems of our digital infrastructure. And I have read the report, but I don't see that it necessarily reconciles that tension to some degree. And I think it's a kind of interesting problem. I just saw, Serkan, your comment in the chat about, the main goal being avoid vendor lock-in, right? Tricky one, I think, but one that's desirable on some level. Does anyone, I'm conscious of time, does anyone have any further comments or want to jump in?
I mean, maybe a couple of more sentences. Again, the way I would see it is that we don't necessarily need to rely on European open source ecosystem, of course. Any open source solution would be okay. But I think the main concern is that we have heavy lock-in to these solutions. And then, for example, there are a lot of complaints that Microsoft is just raising the prices. And because you cannot get out of those cloud solutions, there's no interoperability, let's say, to any other cloud provider, then it creates this monopoly. So just from that perspective, I think one of the key let's say, way of measuring it is what our investment to open source solutions in Europe, let's say, would it reduce the reliance on proprietary solutions? So one of the things that I'm also proposing is to build a software inventory, let's say, both as a service and also standalone solutions, and then check the ratio. What is our ratio on how much we rely on proprietary solutions, how much we rely on open source solutions, and our investment to open source technologies, does it change this ratio? Let's say today is that 90% of our money is going to proprietary solutions, 10% going to open source. We made an investment to open source technologies, and within, I don't know, a few years, does it change to 85 to 15, etc.? That would be one of the key parameters that I would look at. Which means that we are reducing our reliance. Couple of, let's say, my 2 cents.
It's an interesting thought, and it also touches something on something earlier that Zachary mentioned in the comments, which is kind of the sort of time component to these things, right? Obviously the EU moves slowly, and it's probably even slower to adopt something like the Eurostack. So the sort of the uptake of it and the effectiveness of it, the overall impact of it, is not something that's going to be felt or even measurable for years to come, right? Which also on some levels makes it a little harder to justify. But it's interesting that the kind of geopolitical situation has given this real sense of urgency to it. I think. We've got 7 minutes left. I think if it's okay, unless anyone wants to jump in, I'm just seeing Johan, your comment in there. I mean, these are all, it's fantastic. These are all to some degree things that can be measured, or it can be seen through a kind of quantified lens in some way. I would just use the remaining 5 minutes, and perhaps Serkan, this is something we could come back to you on, to propose an idea and perhaps get some thoughts from the group in general. One thing we were discussing is, and this is again to try and make things a bit more sort of concrete and tied to these real world questions of measurement and so on, was perhaps inviting people who are working on related questions of funding impacts and how to measure them, to give sort of guest presentations on the specific problem they're working on. And just as an example of this, I thought of perhaps Avi Press from SCARF, who's got this interesting approach to looking up usage and adoption of open source, and also in which kind of sectors you can find it. This was just a thought. Does anyone have any feedback on this, or even suggestions for speakers that we could invite? Is this also something we would want to do?
Daniel has his hand up.
Sorry, Daniel, I can't see because the sign saying this meeting is being recorded. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So just a question. I was speaking, but probably you were not hearing me. Just to confirm. So for the funding, for the impact we are looking at, so open source solution. So is there a number to what we are looking, or we're just analyzing as wide as we can go? So like, are we putting a number to it, or as many open source that has impact that have been funded? That's what we are looking at, working with.
Well, I'm happy to try and answer that, Daniel, and Dawn, feel free to if you want to jump in as well. We're looking at impacts really broadly conceived. So that can cover a whole range, be it adoption, kind of community health, other economic indicators. See you, Johan, thank you. So we're not, kind of prescriptive or limited in what we want to look at. We recognize that the impacts of funding can be kind of huge and multivariate, and even take place over different timeframes, be positive, be negative, be direct, indirect, can be on the project level, on the ecosystem level. So we're not limited in any way when you're talking about impact.
All right, thanks.
No problem.
My other would be maybe Louis Spia from Tidelift. It might be interesting to hear how they measure the impact of the funding that they provide.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I take it then from the fact that people have already started suggesting names that this is maybe something we do want to explore. I think, it could be a really good forum to sort of invite people to talk quite kind of candidly about their approach, and, pepper them with fun, interesting questions. It might not be something we would do, within the first few meetings, but perhaps once we've kind of established the working group a bit more and gotten used to the sort of structures of it, we could think about, inviting a couple of speakers on. Andrew Nesbitt from Ecosystems would be fantastic as well. Yeah. Oh yeah, and Ryan Ellis. Yeah, he'd be cool.
Yeah, I'd certainly step aside on my time if Andrew Nesbitt could be here.
It'd be awesome. Yeah. Great. Cool. With that, maybe we just use the last 3 minutes to go over the reminders. So we've got the Open Source Summit in North America coming up in June. It's in Denver. There's also CHAOSScon North America, which is around the same time, June 26th. And there's the Open Source Summit EU, which is happening in Amsterdam in August. And the call for proposals is currently open for that, closes on April 14th. And finally, a nice reminder about daylight savings happenings in the US on March 9th. So thank you very much for that, whoever added that in. Excellent.
Yeah, because keep in mind, all of the CHAOSS meetings are tied to, well, most of the CHAOSS meetings are tied to US Central Time Zone. So for those of us in Europe, our meetings are going to shift by an hour for 3 weeks. Fun times. Fun times.
Are we losing 1 hour sleep or gain 1 hour sleep?
Losing. We lose an
That's the
hour.
key question. Nice. Well, I feel like, given the fact that some people are still recovering from frost and flu, and maybe we could all do with an extra hour of sleep. But yeah. Cool. Unless there's, sorry, Milan.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the CHAOSS NA in Denver. Do I need to register separately if I have already registered for OSS Summit?
Yes, so CHAOSScon is an add-on, so you need to go in and amend your registration to add CHAOSScon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
There's
Well,
a tiny additional fee that we mostly put in there to keep to make sure that people are serious about attending. I think it's something like
$10.
$10.
I think it's $10. Yeah.
Yeah.
okay.
No, so sorry, is there a channel on Slack for this conversation?
Yep.
Because
Yep. Happy to post it.
Cannot find the channel.
Yeah, it's WG-funding-impact on the CHAOSS Slack.
WG, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's a working group, so we preface all the working groups with WG, so that's where you'll find it.
Okay.
Daniel, there's a link in Slack, or sorry, a link in chat for the Slack.
Okay. Yeah, I will join the group. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. On that happy note, I think we'll see each other on Slack some other time. And if not, then we've got our next meeting, I believe, on the 12th, which I hope to see
That
everyone
sounds
there.
right. 2 days left in February. It's a 28-day month. 14 minus 2 is 12. Yes, the 12th.
Hold on. Yeah, I didn't use mental arithmetic, just looked at my calendar. Excellent. All right, everyone, take care and see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.
See everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.